Welcome back to the podcast.
We have a great show for you today.
Welcome to the debate. Picture this. You step into an elevator. The doors slide shut and suddenly it's just you and, well, a complete stranger.
Oh, the air just immediately seems to thicken, doesn't it?
Exactly. You're standing side by side in total silence, staring at the floor numbers ticking by, and for some reason, your brain completely forgets how to communicate.
Right. You're just reduced to standing there like a decorative plant.
Like a fern. Yeah. So today, we're exploring the underlying mechanics and the philosophical approach to everyday small talk. We're looking at those fleeting, seemingly minor social interactions.
Like with a neighbor or a colleague in the break room.
Or that stranger in the elevator. Interactions that somehow generate a tremendous amount of social friction and, frankly, anxiety.
It's a fascinating problem, really, because it's so universal. I mean, everyone knows that exact feeling of mild panic.
They do.
So our central question today is this. Is successful small talk fundamentally a matter of mastering active, structured conversational techniques, or is it primarily an exercise in psychological presence and emotional regulation?
A really stark divide.
It is. I'll be arguing that small talk is a highly active mechanical skill. It's something that relies on specific, deliberate conversational tactics to function properly.
And I come at it from a different way entirely. I will argue that the true foundation of human connection has very little to do with conversational architecture. Instead, it has everything to do with a relaxed internal mindset and the acceptance of social awkwardness.
Let's lay out our frameworks. When I look at these everyday interactions, a very distinct reality emerges for me. Small talk is a learned skill.
Okay.
It is not some innate, magical charisma. You don't need a perfectly extroverted personality to do it well. What you actually need is a reliable, structured toolkit.
A toolkit.
Yes, success requires specific actions, beginning with situational awareness. You start with what is already there. The weather, a notoriously long line at the coffee shop, maybe a dog walking by.
The classic openers.
Right. And from there, the structure demands utilizing open-ended questions, the what, how, and why. This carves out space for the other person to step into.
But see, you're already describing it like a construction project.
Well, because it is. It's a deliberate social mechanism. When we struggle with small talk, it is almost always because we lack the linguistic scaffolding to support the interaction.
I'm not sure I agree with that premise.
Well, think about it. Without those tools, we leave ourselves entirely exposed to that dangerous silence. But once you learn the mechanics, it's profoundly empowering. You gain the power to actively facilitate connection, rather than just crossing your fingers and passively hoping it magically occurs.
I hear your point, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. When we actually examine the evidence around why people freeze in that elevator, the primary barrier is never a lack of linguistic skill.
You don't think so?
No, not at all. It's not a failure to deploy the correct interrogative pronoun. The barrier is internal tension. It's self-consciousness. We take a very simple, mundane moment and we elevate it into a high-stakes public performance.
So you think it's entirely a mental block?
I do, yes. The true foundation of small talk isn't about memorizing conversational algorithms or flawlessly executing an open-ended question. It's about relinquishing the test mentality.
The test mentality?
Right. Nobody is standing in that elevator with a clipboard grading your comment about the rain. Success comes down to putting yourself and the other person at ease. It's a psychological state.
But how does that state actually create a conversation?
Because when your mind relaxes, the words naturally follow. If you approach the interaction aiming for warmth and normality, rather than trying to construct the perfect conversational architecture, the social friction just dissolves. The goal isn't to sound brilliant, it's simply to make the moment lighter.
If you're listening to this and thinking, well, I hate small talk because it always feels so forced and fake, that is exactly the tension we're talking about right now. And I see why you think just relaxing is the answer.
It's the most intuitive solution.
Intuitive? Maybe.
But let me give you a different perspective on why relying purely on a relaxed psychological state is completely insufficient.
Go ahead.
Let's look at the actual, practical trajectory of a conversation. You can be the most relaxed, warm, and well-intentioned person in the room, but if you don't use specific tactics, the conversation will still die.
Die is a strong word.
But it's true. Think about the basic mechanic of catching a ball and throwing it back. A conversation is a reciprocal exchange of energy and information.
Sure.
So if someone says to you, "Oh, I went to a great bookstore this weekend," and you simply smile warmly at them because your internal state is at ease.
Well, obviously you have to respond.
But that's the point. If you don't respond structurally, the exchange terminates. It's over. The necessary tactic there is the targeted follow-up.
Meaning you have to throw the ball back.
Precisely. You have to say, "Oh, really? What kind of books do you look for?" That is a mechanical deployment of an open-ended question.
Right, but
I like to think of relying solely on good intentions without technique as being akin to having a beautifully warm house with no doors. People might sense the warmth radiating from the outside, but they literally cannot get inside.
unless you build them a door.
Exactly. Unless you provide a structured linguistic opening for them to walk through.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered how those doors feel to the other person when they are built without genuine curiosity?
How do you mean?
Well, tactics fail entirely without the correct internal state. If you mechanically deploy an open-ended question purely because you read it's the correct tactic, it often feels like homework to the person receiving it.
Homework. Really?
Absolutely, because it comes across with this terrible robotic energy. It translates as, "Hello, human, please give more details so I can continue my social exercise."
Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration.
Is it, though? We've all been on the receiving end of that. Someone is asking all the right questions, but their eyes are completely dead. A technically perfect open question fails if it isn't preceded by genuine intent.
Well, I won't deny that authenticity matters.
It's everything. You argue that the tactic creates the space, but I would argue the psychological state, the sincere desire to connect, must precede the technique. Human beings possess a highly attuned radar for authenticity.
They do.
We can intuitively feel the difference between a sincere inquiry and an orchestrated exercise. If the warmth is truly there, even a grammatically flawed or structurally clumsy response will land successfully.
I have to admit, your point about an orchestrated exercise feeling like homework to the other person is a real risk. No one wants to feel like they're being processed by a conversational algorithm.
Right, it's exhausting. But even with genuine curiosity, structural pitfalls exist that can trap perfectly well-meaning people. Have you considered what happens when someone accidentally uses a conversation killer?
What do you mean by a conversation killer in this context?
I'm talking about those perfectly polite, well-intentioned closed questions that accidentally strand the other person.
Give me an example.
Let's say you ask, "Did you have a good weekend?" You can ask that with all the warmth and authenticity in the world, but you've just shifted the entire conversational burden onto the other person.
Because it's a yes or no question.
Right. They say yes, and suddenly both of you are just standing there holding the broken pieces of a conversation. The exchange falls to the floor immediately.
But why is that a failure? Because you haven't managed the structural requirements of the interaction. You force them to do all the heavy lifting to keep it alive.
I see.
You have to actively choose the how and what questions to give people the space to elaborate. It's about hospitality. A closed question is bad hospitality, regardless of your internal warmth.
I don't disagree that open questions are useful tools. I really don't. But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are treating the broken conversation as a catastrophic failure of technique.
Not catastrophic, just a breakdown.
But if a conversation stalls, your immediate instinct is to say the architecture failed. My perspective is that the pressure to constantly keep the ball in the air is exactly what makes people so anxious in the first place.
Wait, are you saying the silence itself is the goal?
Not the goal, but it shouldn't be the enemy. Look at your example. If you ask, "Did you have a good weekend?" and they say yes, and a pause follows.
The dreaded pause.
Right. But why must that be viewed as a failure? It is only a failure if you are treating the interaction as a test of your engaging personality.
That's an interesting way to frame it.
If your internal state is truly at ease, that silence isn't a failure. It's just a shared moment of quiet. The problem only arises when your brain immediately starts looking for the emergency exit because you feel you've run out of tactical maneuvers.
But that fear of the silence, that panic, is exactly why we need the tools. Which brings us to a really critical point of contention.
Okay, what's that?
How we actually handle those moments of failure. When that dangerous silence hits, or when an unfamiliar word is spoken and comprehension breaks down, what do?
You're going to say we need an active solution.
I argue that the solution must be highly active, yes. Our brains freeze because of a deep, evolutionary fear of social rejection. If we do nothing, we enter into what is brilliantly called the polite scarecrow phenomena.
Oh, the polite scarecrow? Just standing there smiling and nodding blankly?
Exactly. You are physically present but completely disconnected from the exchange because you just don't know what to say.
Yeah, I've definitely been there.
We all have. The active technique here is to explicitly ask for clarification. Saying something like, "Sorry, I'm not familiar with that term. What do you mean by that?"
Right.
This isn't just about getting information. It's a structural repair. Doing this actually makes a speaker sound far more articulate because it keeps the communication channel open. Being articulate isn't about knowing every word in the dictionary. It's about actively managing the clarity of the conversation.
I hear the logic there, I really do. But I reframe those moments entirely.
How so?
Well, you are still framing the awkward silence or the misunderstood word as a structural error that must be immediately fixed with a tool. The key to handling the dangerous silence is actually psychological acceptance.
Acceptance?
Yes. There is a profound truth we often ignore, which is that some moments are simply allowed to be awkward.
But if you just stand there accepting the awkwardness, doesn't the interaction degrade? I mean, you are abandoning the shared responsibility of the exchange.
Not at all. I am abandoning the artificial performance of the exchange. The crucial psychological choice in that moment of silence is not to desperately search your mental toolkit for the right clarification phrase.
Then what is the choice?
The choice is to realize that a weird moment is not the end of the world. Perhaps the other person simply needs a little time to gather their thoughts. When you stop fearing awkwardness, you become braver.
Braver.
Yes, and bravery matters significantly more than smoothness.
Bravery over smoothness. I like the sound of that, but how does it actually play out in real time?
It plays out by letting go of the ego. A slightly awkward human being who is comfortable in their own skin, even if they're visibly struggling to find a topic, is vastly preferable to a perfect robot frantically deploying recovery tactics.
Fair enough.
When a misunderstanding happens, yes, asking for clarification is fine, but the reason it works isn't because it's a clever tactic. It works because it demonstrates vulnerability. It shows you're willing to look foolish in order to connect. That is a psychological posture, not a conversational technique.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Vulnerability is wonderful, and I completely agree it's the core of connection.
Right.
But vulnerability still requires a behavioral manifestation. It needs a vehicle. Let's look at the end of a conversation, which is notoriously difficult for people. The dreaded parking lot trap.
Oh, the long goodbye.
Right. Two people are talking, the natural energy of the conversation has clearly depleted, but neither person knows how to leave, so they just stand there.
Looking at their watches.
Yeah, they start developing that strained, long goodbye face, shifting their weight, and eventually they become trapped in a parking lot for 27 minutes.
It happens to the best of us.
It does. And I argue that no amount of psychological ease will extract you from that parking lot. You need a specific, polite exit phrase.
Like what? Give me a tactic.
Like, well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but it was really great catching up. That is a highly tactical, structural element of conversation.
Okay, sure.
It provides a clean, mutually understood boundary. Without that technique, the warmth and the vulnerability you're talking about simply lead to a lingering, uncomfortable entrapment. The technique is the release valve.
The exit phrase is a convention, certainly, but let's dig into why people get trapped in the parking lot to begin with. Why does our brain freeze there?
I'd say a lack of tools.
I disagree. They get trapped because of psychological tension. They are terrified of being perceived as rude or dismissive. They lack the internal permission to simply conclude an interaction and walk away.
Well, because walking away feels like a rejection.
Exactly. It's an emotional fear. It is not a linguistic deficit. If you are truly at ease with yourself and the other person, you can say almost anything to end a conversation or say very little, and it feels totally natural.
You still have to say something.
Sure, but you could literally just say, all right, I'm going to head out, and smile, and it's fine. The sophisticated technique only works because it serves the underlying psychological need to cleanly release that social pressure. If the psychology is wrong, even the best exit phrase sounds like a brush-off.
But that fear of being trapped in the parking lot isn't just about awkwardness. It points to the whole reason we even bother doing this, which is trying to build a bridge without being annoying.
Right.
Let's look at the ultimate function of these exchanges. If we apply the lens of skill and structure, the function of small talk is active connection building. It's a transformative process. You begin with something incredibly mundane, like noticing a long line at the grocery store or commenting on the music playing in a cafe.
The raw ambient material?
Yes, exactly. But by being observant, by utilizing your open questions and your follow-ups, you actively transform that raw ambient material into a substantive exchange that builds rapport. You're structuring it into a bridge between two people.
I see what you're saying, but
The function is to elevate the interaction from mere physical proximity to actual human engagement.
I think elevating small talk to active connection building places far too heavy a burden on it. And honestly, I think that expectation is exactly why people find it so terrifying.
Really?
Yeah, we think every chat about the weather needs to be a profound bridge-building exercise. The function of small talk is far simpler and far more humble. It is simply about reducing social friction.
Just friction reduction? Doesn't that render the interaction somewhat hollow? I mean, we're aiming for the lowest possible bar.
I strongly disagree that friction reduction is a low bar. In a world where people are constantly on edge, isolated, staring at their phones, and overwhelmed by self-consciousness,
That's true.
right? Making a moment lighter for a stranger is a profoundly beautiful act. It is not hollow at all. The magic is merely in sounding human. The goal is to lower the stakes.
I suppose that's fair.
If two people share a few words about the rain and the tension in the elevator dissipates and both parties walk out feeling a bit more at ease, the small talk has completely succeeded. It doesn't need to achieve deep conversational depth to be a success.
I hear ya. But by treating it as a skill to be honed, we open the door to moments where people truly hit it off. You know that feeling? When a conversation just flows effortlessly.
Oh, absolutely. It's the best.
Right. And that rapid connection is almost always facilitated by someone in the dynamic being highly observant, noticing a small detail and asking a genuinely engaging follow-up question. The structure is what enables the depth.
But think about what's actually happening when you hit it off with someone. That phenomenon is almost purely chemical and psychological. It happens when two people drop their masks, remove the test mentality, and find a shared resonance.
But they use words to do that.
Yes, but it happens despite conversational structures, not because of them. When you hit it off with a stranger at a party, you aren't mentally scanning a float chart to decide whether to use an open or closed question. You are entirely present in the moment. The mechanics fade away completely when the psychology is aligned.
Okay, but the mechanics fading away doesn't mean they aren't there. Think about it like driving a highly familiar route.
Okay.
You might arrive at your driveway and realize you don't consciously remember making the last 4 turns. You were completely lost in thought, totally present in your own mind.
Right.
But your hands were still turning the wheel. Your brain was still actively scanning for brake lights and pedestrians the entire time. The mechanics were still keeping you alive. The fact that the conversational skill has become unconscious muscle memory doesn't mean the skill is absent. You're still steering the conversation.
That's a great analogy, really. But let me push it one step further.
Okay?
If you are a new driver and you are gripping the steering wheel so tightly your knuckles are white, and you are obsessing over every single mirror check and pedal press,
You're nervous.
you are a danger on the road. You are far more likely to crash because you're overthinking it. The people who are best at small talk are those who allow themselves to just be human, to be ordinary, and to let the moments be what they are without frantically trying to engineer them into something profound.
Let's summarize our positions in light of this. Look, I maintain that recognizing small talk as a structured mechanical skill is profoundly empowering.
Okay.
When we demystify the interaction, when we break it down into actionable openers, observant follow-ups that catch the ball and throw it back, and clear, polite exit phrases, we give people a tangible toolkit. We remove the paralyzing expectation that one must simply be naturally charismatic.
Right.
By mastering the scaffolding of conversation, we don't have to fear the dangerous silence. We can actively facilitate connection, navigate past the conversation killers, and ensure that the people we speak with actually feel heard.
And I remain convinced that adding toolkits and mechanics to an already stressful situation often exacerbates the exact problem we're trying to solve.
Naturally.
The true key to unlocking natural human interaction lies in releasing the psychological burden. When we remove the test mentality, when we accept that awkwardness is an inevitable and perfectly acceptable part of human contact, we liberate ourselves. Bravery matters more than smoothness. By focusing simply on being at ease and aiming only to make the moment lighter rather than perfectly orchestrated, we strip away the self-consciousness that causes us to freeze up in the first place.
I will acknowledge a significant point of convergence here, though. Whether you're focusing on the linguistic mechanics of an open-ended question or the internal state of being at ease, we both agree that the ultimate value of small talk lies in creating warmth.
Absolutely.
It's about moving past our own fear of judgment and recognizing the humanity in the person standing next to us.
The shared goal is connection. Even if we fundamentally disagree on the vehicle required to get there. It's fascinating because understanding both the mechanics of conversation and the underlying psychology allows for a much more holistic approach to our everyday interactions. And obviously, there is so much more to explore regarding the deep nuances of how humans actually connect.
Indeed, there is. And we will leave it to you, the listener, to decide. The next time you find yourself stepping into an elevator with a total stranger and those doors slide shut,
The moment of truth.
will you meticulously build a conversational bridge, or will you simply take a breath, accept the silence, and just be human?